Hi everybody, I'm Tina McCorkindale. I'm the president and CEO of the Institute for Public Relations. If you're not familiar with who we are, we're a great partner of Page, and we are a research nonprofit, and we do research in PR and comms for free. So I'm really excited about this great panel, and we're gonna talk about some about disinformation. So IPR does an annual disinformation study where we survey 2,000 Americans with Morning Consult and find out how they perceive disinformation, how they trust certain sources for what they get their information. It's a great tee up with this previous conversation, and also its impact on society. So in our previous survey we did last year, we found that 75% said disinformation is a threat to democracy. And that's on both sides of the political aisle, which is typically where we found a lot of differences otherwise. We define disinformation as deliberately misleading or false information. We differentiate that from misinformation, which is just false information. But for us, thinking about people who are deliberately trying to mislead is what we're particularly interested in and we think is really important for the profession. So today, I assembled a panel of experts to talk about some of the science behind disinformation influence. And I'm so excited because they're all super brilliant and smart. And I'm gonna each ask them to introduce themselves briefly. That way you can identify who they are here. And then we're gonna get into some questions individually. We'll have time for Q&A, and then we'll also ask questions about the impact for our communicators. All right? Okay. Let's get started. So first, let's start off with Dr. Anni Sternisko. If you want to just introduce yourself, 30 seconds, and say who you are and what you study.
Okay, yeah, I'm Anni Sternisko. I study conspiracy theories, political polarization, ideology, and everything that is related to that. I'm working as a social scientist and consultant in these fields, trying to find solutions for problems that are data-driven. I received my PhD from NYU in social psychology.
Fantastic. Megan Conroy.
My name is Megan Conroy. I am the U.S. Research Fellow at the Digital Forensic Research Lab, which is housed within the Atlantic Council in D.C. And I am an extremism expert. I specialize specifically in far-right extremism.
Super cool also. All right, Dr. Kieran Garamella.
Hi, I am a faculty at Rutgers University on the other side of the pond. In the School of Communication and Information. I have a background in computer science, so I do a lot of data-driven stuff, and we study societal issues like the same stuff like political polarization, misinformation, and hate speech and stuff like that on social media. Specifically, my research has looked at more of the private encrypted spaces and the prevalence of misinformation in those spaces, like WhatsApp, for instance. Yeah.
Great. Lisa.
And I'm Lisa Kaplan. I'm the founder of Alethea. We are a company that detects and mitigates instances of disinformation, misinformation, and social media manipulation. We primarily work with Fortune 1000s. We do some work with democracies. Unfortunately, if you are a country like China or Russia, you are disqualified from working with us, although every once in a while they try. And we not only focus on where are these narratives that are being weaponized, whether it's a short seller attack or something that's targeting your CEO or causing a reputation issue coming from, but we really focus on the what do you do about it? Where can you take a legal action, a communications action, a security action? And what we've found is that communicators really are risk managers now in a new way because you're dealing with all this information outside the system. So we've developed technology and solutions to deal with that.
Fantastic. Good panel. All right, so let's start with Anni. So Anni, you do some really interesting research in conspiracy theories. So maybe just give us, and I want to make sure we're all on the same page, just tell us a little bit about defining what a conspiracy theory is and why is it problematic for our society?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the way I think about conspiracy theories is that they're a theory that a group is secretly working towards a goal that is in their own interest and against the common good, and in a way that undermines societal rule and norms. And what you notice with that definition is that they're not necessarily wrong or irrational. I think oftentimes we equate conspiracy theories with falsehood. That's not the case. We have so many examples where conspiracy theories turn out to be true. We know the Purdue Pharma case, the Watergate scandal. It happens all the time. So it's not necessarily irrational to believe them, But what I'm interested in, and I think most people here in the room, are the conspiracy theories that are irrational to believe, that are likely to be false. And they tend to be related to harm to the individual and to society at large. So conspiracy theories have been related to undermine trust in authorities, vaccine hesitancy, discrimination, engagement in criminal activities, as well as violence, political violence that we've seen on January 6th, as well as a lot of mass shootings that have been sparked by racist conspiracy theories. And that is how I understand them as a whole.
Yeah, and you can see with all that you just named how significant of an impact it can be on society. So Dr. Sternisko did a really cool study of 50 countries with nearly 52,000 participants. So she had a large sample size. And she found a consistent factor, like a personality factor, of what people have when they believe conspiracy theories and when they share conspiracy theories. So maybe you want to talk briefly about some of the findings and like what is that factor that impacts people's willingness to share and believe?
So to give you some background on this study, we conducted it during the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw all these conspiracy theories about the pandemic popping up. And as social psychologists, we were interested in the social dynamics behind it and whether there are social factors that drive people to believe them, but also to share them, because we really saw that on social media, that is where they thrive. So we wanted to understand who is sharing, who's clicking on the sharing button. So what we found was that a concept called national narcissism was related to the belief in COVID-19 conspiracy theories, as well as people's willingness to share them. And you can think of national narcissism kind of as an inflated belief in the greatness of one's nation, coupled with the concern that other people don't sufficiently recognize that greatness. So I think we are all familiar with the term of individual vulnerable narcissism, and it's very similar, it's just on a group level. So people who score high in national narcissism tend to have an exaggerated belief of how great one's nation is. They think the nation is entitled to special treatment. They are very concerned with the image of the nation, and they go to great lengths to defend it. And they are hypersensitive to criticism as well. And I can go a little bit more in the theoretical background, but I think for the interest of time, I just jump into the results. Basically, what we found was that people who scored high on national narcissism were more likely to believe in conspiracy theories across 53 out of the 56 countries that we surveyed, which was quite remarkable. Usually we found cultural differences, especially in conspiracy theories, but it appeared to be a very common factor. In the US and in the UK, we had additional data sets where we also saw that people who scored high in national narcissism were more likely to share conspiracy theories online. And it seems like an obvious finding. It actually wasn't that obvious, because people are very aware of the reputation costs that come with sharing conspiracy theories. But people who scored high on national narcissism, who are so concerned with defending that image, were ready to jeopardize their own reputation online in order to share conspiracy theories that might defend the image in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. And one thing to note too is that it was a quite robust finding. So we looked at other factors that we thought might explain that relationship, so gullibility or just people not being informed about the pandemic, critical thinking, and all these factors couldn't account for that relationship. So it was really a social dynamic story that we found.
So what's interesting about that is because we assume that people will share conspiracy theories because they just don't know any better. So we should throw more information at them, and then they'll all of a sudden change their mind. But you're saying that's not actually the case, that doesn't actually help change their perspective. So what can you do? How can you take a personality factor like national narcissism and use that in a way to change attitudes and behaviors, or can you? Or is it you're just sort of stuck with it?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of ways to go about it. National narcissism is a tricky one because it is relatively stable. So in social psychology, we always go like, when we think about interventions, solutions is like oftentimes, okay, let's address the motive. Why do national narcissists tend to share and believe these conspiracy theories? And it's oftentimes that national narcissism is rooted in a lack of self-esteem, in a lack of sense of control and autonomy. So ideally, we create a society or a narrative in our community where people feel more empowered and don't even turn to these kind of narcissistic beliefs about their nations, but it's also not very practical, or it's really hard to do. So some solutions we were thinking in light of our data was, can we change the narrative that how we talk about COVID-19 and the public health implications of it. So one reason why we thought that this relationship occurred is that national narcissists found their nation was threatened by the pandemic because there was this narrative that the government is failing, and this idea that the nation is strong and invincible was kind of threatened. So conspiracy theories about COVID-19 were kind of a nice way to dismiss that threat. So maybe we can think about framing pandemics differently, where it doesn't activate the threat about one's nation, or framing solution as a way to make your nation look good, because that's ultimately what they care about. It's the image of the nation. So if you get vaccinated, we will be the country that has the highest vaccine rate. And we actually have another set of studies where we found that motivates people to engage in health behaviors if they think it serves their nation's image.
That's fantastic. That's so interesting. All right, so let's still go to Dr. Garimella. He's really interesting because he's built algorithms, because he has a computer science background, to study echo chambers, and it's fascinating. So Kieran, do you maybe want to talk a little bit about your research on echo chambers and some of your findings with that?
Sure, yeah. So echo chambers are this phenomena where you are consuming and producing the same content, the content of the same, let's say, political affiliation, right? So you're in these sorts of chambers where you hear your own voice. So that's the echo chamber here. So in a political setup, this would be okay, I'm only consuming news that is of a certain political belief. And I mean, obviously, this doesn't seem like it's a bad thing, but and then, traditionally, historically, we've all had our own, political affiliations, and we, have had choices where we consume media that agrees with our own beliefs. What's wrong with that, right? So the problem now with social media and the algorithmification of everything we consume is that there's usually, traditionally what happened, you got your news from your TV, where you had 3 channels and you could pick one, right? You got your news from your newspaper, where you had a bunch of options, you could pick one. But now with the algorithms, what's happening is you have the user choices. I choose to follow Fox News, but then the algorithm is also recommending, based on these choices, some things that you don't have control over, right? So that is where this sort of feedback loop is. Part of it is missing from a user's control. So that's where these echo chambers on social media become really problematic. And we have a large study on Twitter where we show that this is a huge problem, and a large set of population is actually really stuck in these. And we don't know the mechanism, whether this is happening because of users' personal choices or if an algorithm is actually influencing them. And this was done maybe 5 years ago, and the power of and the role of algorithms has since just improved or increased, right? So we were talking about TikTok earlier. Maybe everyone's talking about TikTok, right? So now it's much more powerful, and it's getting even more bigger. And those will impact these the consumption and beliefs of information that we have, and put people in these echo chambers. So that was the context.
It's interesting. How many of you use WhatsApp? WhatsApp people,
Ooh.
So pretty much everybody. Okay, that's cool. Dr. Garimella also does research on WhatsApp and looking at the spread of misinformation, because it's different, because it's a personal messaging platform compared to others like Facebook and some of the other social platforms. So do you want to maybe talk about some of your research on misinformation and hate speech, specifically on WhatsApp, which is bigger in other countries and stuff?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised that at least maybe 40% of the room said they use WhatsApp. WhatsApp, which is great because
Because they have so many global companies, it's probably what a
I
lot
assume.
of the, yeah.
I mean, I've been in rooms where maybe one hand went up and I was like, oh yeah, WhatsApp is this messaging app. And I had to define what WhatsApp is. At least, okay, people know here. If you don't know, it's like this huge, messaging service. Billions of people use it. It's very, very popular in the global south. And so we study, my team, misinformation and disinformation, political propaganda, and so on in this context. And particularly, WhatsApp is not very popular in the US. By very popular, I mean, it's used by almost a quarter of the population, which is the same fraction of the people that use Twitter. Twitter, everyone in this room is really thinks of Twitter as a big deal, but WhatsApp is as much of a big deal as as Twitter. But in general, for instance, there are countries like India and Brazil, India where I'm from, where WhatsApp is just used by everyone, right? So WhatsApp is the internet. Like India, Brazil is similar. And what happens there is political parties have figured out that, okay, everyone is on WhatsApp, especially people who are coming online for the first time, and hundreds of millions of people are on this platform and only on this platform, and they've created strategies to spread political content through WhatsApp. Some of it is benign political content, just messaging of the parties. Some of it is propaganda. Some of it borders into misinformation, hate speech. And I mean, the thing with these tools is they enable this sort of massive, fast spread of information, right? That's again the problem. And yeah, so we studied these in multiple contexts, like in India, Brazil, Pakistan, and so on. And we show how this sort of personal messaging and to WhatsApp's credit, they've designed it in such a way. I mean, it's a peer-to-peer communication platform. It's not like a platform where you can, just send a message to 1 million people, like an influencer on Instagram or Facebook can do, right? Like on WhatsApp, you cannot broadcast to more than 200 members at a time. It's well designed. But if you have infrastructures like big political parties, they can really do this sort of mass manipulation. And because of this encrypted nature of WhatsApp, WhatsApp is one of the biggest end-to-end encrypted platforms, which is very good for privacy. But because of that encrypted nature, there's no moderation at all, right? Even WhatsApp cannot see what is spreading on that platform. So what political parties have done is misuse that to not just spread this sort of hate speech, misinformation kind of stuff, but also use that as a platform for manipulation of other platforms. So you come and create your infrastructure to make collective action through WhatsApp, planning through WhatsApp, but then impact other platforms. One of the studies that we have, we showed how groups of people, hundreds of people, are decide something, they say, okay, let's trend this hashtag, and we all post this set of tweets at this particular time. They go on Twitter, just copy paste the tweets from a Google Doc that is created and disseminated through WhatsApp, and that gets trending on Twitter, right? And the bad thing about this is, okay, they're using these encrypted platforms, which are very difficult to moderate, to then create some sort of action on another platform. So there's this sort of cross-platform nature of manipulation and influence operations, which we don't necessarily think of. We think of, okay, Twitter should do something, or Facebook should do something, but there could be these sorts of multi-platform efforts as well that could happen. And some of these could just be hidden.
It's really interesting, because I feel like we do a lot with Facebook, Twitter, and the spread of disinformation, but the personal messaging platforms pose some extra challenges. So Megan, you were an investigator with the this thing called the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. Everyone may have heard of that at some time.
Wish I hadn't.
So do you want to talk about your experience with that? And she also did some really cool stuff on conspiracy theories and mass radicalization, which is what we saw for the January 6th attack. So please.
Yes, so I, for a year, I was an investigator on the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, where I led the committee's investigation into kind of the various things that happened that sat at the nexus of the media ecosystem, as well as, obviously, extremism. And what was, there are a lot of interesting findings, but I think the things that are most interesting to you all would be kind of the specific narratives around which, when I say diverse, I mean largely on one side of the ideological spectrum, but people had diverse grievances, and they all mobilized under a specific banner, And that banner was a lie, which was that the 2020 election was stolen. And that is there's no evidence that it was stolen, that was established, and yet it was enough to not only mobilize people to show up on January 6th, which is fine, that's your First Amendment right, go nuts. But honestly, there were some sick posts on like weird forums where people were like, hey, I'm gonna have like 10 gallons of chili by the Lincoln Memorial, come hang out. Like, that sounds great, have a good time. But obviously, where I'm concerned is the people who are willing to kill or die for a lie that was fundamentally anti-democratic. And ultimately, when we dug into the inner workings of this information ecosystem that we're all a part of, I think a lot of people kind of hyper-focus on social media while kind of neglecting the role of other forms of media. So people weren't really analyzing cable news or local news or podcasts across the various places where podcasts are hosted, as well as online shows. Actually, I'm not going to name them. You don't need to go watch them. But basically, that's why they pay me. So I think ultimately what was fascinating is just really having this empirical backing for just the bombardment of bullshit that people were being hit with. We established I could say that.
Bullshit.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Too late now. But essentially everywhere people turned, whether they turned on their TV, they just opened their computers, talking to friends and family, listening to a podcast on their commute, talking to friends, I said talking to friends and family, but really that is where a lot of people get their news. And I think the fact is of course people were gonna believe this because they were hearing it from everyone and they were hearing it from people that they trusted to tell them the truth. And obviously, like I said, the people I was most concerned about is those who were radicalized to violence, those who were willing to take action against members of Congress, against police, against their fellow Americans, against Vice President Pence. Those are the people I'm most concerned about. And I think what was really jarring was just the sheer volume of seemingly everyday Americans who were willing to kill and die for a lie. And it wasn't just the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys. The vast majority of people who showed up on January 6th were not members of groups. They were not, adherents to QAnon, which is obviously an extremist movement. So I think that was really fascinating, but also it's hard to draw kind of these broad conclusions because radicalization is a fundamentally individualized process. What motivates someone to take up arms against a perceived enemy is going to differ from person to person. But January 6th was a fascinating case study of what my peers have talked about, where their conspiracy theories, the roles of algorithms on social media, and what was allowed to happen on social media platforms that was blatantly violative of those respective platforms' policies, those who actually have content moderation policies. And ultimately, they all came together under one banner. And luckily, we haven't seen anything of the sort since, and hopefully we won't again.
Are we gonna see it again?
I really don't want to be on committee part 2 electric for blue. Okay. Oh, great.
No, they can call it to the
No, I just don't. For a lot of reasons, I don't think we're going to have another January 6th anytime soon. I sure hope I'm right, but I think ultimately the thing that, like I said, the thing that united these folks, regardless of whether they were mobilized because they just really didn't want Joe Biden to be president, or whether they actually believed the election had been stolen, or if there are single issue folks who were just like, no, I don't want this person in office. The same thing that mobilizes people to the polls, it's going to be the same thing that mobilizes people to a protest. But ultimately, within the context of Trump doesn't have the same support that he used to. A lot of people feel betrayed by him because he didn't get the political prisoners out of who were arrested and charged with their crimes related to January 6th. He hasn't, pardoned them, bailed them out, et cetera. And ultimately, people have been held to account, right? For doing those crimes, and people are nervous. And to, the point of WhatsApp, a lot of the things that I monitor day to day in open source forums and online and on social media, people know that people like me are observing these spaces and keeping an eye out, because of course there's shit posting every day. Plenty of people just post on the internet, they don't mean it. They can post whatever they want, but it's obviously when people are kind of cross that threshold into being oh, this is a legitimate threat. And we're still seeing those every day, just like we did in the lead up to January 6th. Doesn't mean we take them seriously, but what we are admittedly concerned about is kind of this collaboration and co-radicalization and co-mobilization that's happening in these hyper-network spaces, but behind closed doors. Because that's what Charlottesville, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville would turn violent. That was planned largely on Discord. January 6th, a lot of the planning happened on Parler. And so it's just, they're highly adaptive and just shifting to new spaces.
Then you wonder, well, you also had when they showed up, like you said, they were like, come get chili and stuff. And, in hindsight, what was the, all these different factors. You said there's also many individual factors, but actually going in and having this like mob mentality, they'll mobilize for that.
Absolutely. And I think that's ultimately it is the vast majority of the people there weren't doing crimes, right? They weren't attacking, they weren't getting violent, they weren't attacking members of police, they weren't trying to kill members of Congress. But the fact of the matter is we still had tens of thousands of people show up willing to do anything to keep the President Trump in power based on a lie. And the spread of that disinformation through the entire ecosystem is what remains concerning.
Yeah. Lisa. Fix this, Lisa.
Working on it.
So Lisa is the CEO of a company, Alethea, and they do some really cool work. And well, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do, and then I'll get into some of the details with.
Yeah, so we detect and mitigate instances of disinformation, misinformation, and social media manipulation. So we actually did a lot of work around like January 6th, for example, at the time as part of our public interest work, and then also in the aftermath as well, and couldn't agree more with all of Megan's comments. But the bulk of our work is really helping, I would say, Fortune 1000 large companies understand like what does this mean if and when it happens to them. The reality is, the threat landscape has changed since 2016 and even 2020. What I mean by that is 2016 was almost the glory days of this space. Like disinformation as a concept isn't new. And what was happening is propaganda was essentially being moved on to social media, predominantly platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, where information is designed to be disseminated at scale into these algorithmic silos that Kieran has spoken about so eloquently, so that you're reaching the people that you want to reach. Marketers' heaven, also an adversary's heaven, because that means that going back to this question of radicalization, there's no one meme that makes somebody wake up and say, today is the day I bring my zip ties to the United States Capitol. That's just not how this works. So instead, though, it's this slow drip, death by 1,000 paper cuts over time. And we already now have these groups and communities that are radicalized to believe things like a sex trafficking ring got busted at Disney in February. And because of that, Disney's part of this broader conspiracy about trafficking children. And because of that, you shouldn't go to the parks, you should boycott, you should do all of these things. And there were fundamental real-world impacts to Disney because of these narratives. You look at the impacts, there was a CEO change. Like they got through Florida and DeSantis, if we want to talk about Florida and DeSantis. But that is, these are real-world impacts that are now starting to target brands who are starting to become symbols of all of this, I think, cultural angst. And so what do you do when what do you do when all of a sudden you're being mentioned by QAnon? What does that mean to you for a risk? Are you gonna have a Wayfair situation on your hands? Or even more interesting, what do you do when the QAnon people who are probably espousing, beliefs that go counter to your company values are all of a sudden holding you up as their biggest champion? And guess what? They're your customers. And all of a sudden you have the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal calling you and asking you for comment. So a lot of the work that we do is really focused around early detection because this is oftentimes open source. Yes, it does happen on platforms like WhatsApp, Discord you can still get into, and there are legal and ethical ways to do that. But a lot of these actors, going back to what's changed, in 2016, it was just really the Russians and a couple others. They were on Twitter. They weren't using VPNs. They were all operating off the same server. They were attributed in like under 30 seconds. And it was like, oh, it's Russia. Iran is still that sloppy. Now we're starting to see it's something like over 88 countries was the most recent research from Oxford engaging in this. And that doesn't include, of course, criminals and competitors. So we are seeing that the threat has proliferated, and what we're able to do is come in and tell people what's happening before it gets to Twitter, because that's often a 2 to 3 week lead time if there's a narrative that's starting in some of these other spaces. What rules are being broken? These bad guys don't really care about the law, so what laws are being broken? How can you counter message in a subtle way without inadvertently amplifying the narrative? And we built technology to be able to do this, because I'm sure while a lot of you and your agencies have like Meltwater, Brandwatch, those sorts of tools, which are great for measuring the success of your campaign, they're difficult for identifying these campaigns against you. So our company really focuses in on the what can you do about it, and where are those trigger points to take action and stop a crisis before it starts.
Okay, everyone start thinking of your questions. I know I have like 10 minutes on the clock, so maybe just we'll do like 45-second answers. I have 2 questions for you, and then we'll do a quick question about impact communicators, and then we'll get to this. We'll get this, don't worry. All right, so what do you do, Lisa, when like people who believe conspiracy theories, as Anni talked about, become your fans?
It's a great question. So it depends, I would say, really on the issue. I think you have to take into a couple of factors. One, are they actually a stakeholder that you care about? Are they your customers? They're probably not your investors, but you never know. And so what is the message that you want to send them? We typically, particularly when it's more of these communities like QAnon that have like violent tendencies, we do encourage people, even if they're becoming your fans, to let your security teams know, just because you never know when somebody's gonna show up, particularly if the group has a history of a threat of violence. Other thing I would do too is think about the assets that you own as a communicator. So especially with these loosely based conspiracy theories, QAnon doesn't have a pope, for example, who's coming in and interpreting doctrine. It's much more of a loosely organized conspiracy where people will choose their own adventure. And so if you're aware, for example, that QAnon is saying how great your company is to work at because you're going to stop the sex trafficking being conducted by the deep state cabal, ranging from Hillary Clinton to George Soros to John Podesta to Bill Gates. You may want to actually be putting other content on your website to be able to redirect those narratives. If they're, saying things that you are a leader in stopping adrenochrome from getting harvested, maybe put up some actual science as to what the work your company is doing. What that will do is when you think about the psychology of these individuals, they're then coming to your website, and if you're looking 3 moves down on the chessboard, how is that message going to be received? So really understanding that audience and your goal is super important.
So this question is for everyone. So you're in a room full of communicators. Many are responsible. They have a lot of great connections to the media. They are responsible for internal audiences, their employees, and getting the message out, and also for a lot of external audiences, customers, the community. So what do you think their role is, and if you have any tips for what they can do to help their employees and stakeholders understand and prepare to, it's a very loaded question, but prepare against disinformation. So we can start with you, Lisa, and then we'll open up to the others.
Yeah, so I think the number one thing to remember, and you need the data and the analysis behind this to make it happen, but nobody likes to get fooled, is the ultimate counter message. So we highly recommend, and what we've seen be successful, is expose the narrative and the actor behind it with evidence, with accounts. Here's how it's spreading. Here's how the information flow works. Be able to work with the media to tell that story, to have people understand why, so that way the narrative isn't, can I pick on you, Tina?
Please.
Oh,
Everyone picks on me in this audience anyway, so feel free.
That way the narrative about Tina isn't Tina, kicks dogs in her spare time. It's Lisa started this narrative about Tina saying that Tina kicks dogs in her spare time because Lisa's really jealous of Tina's dog. That is how you can be, add more context. So I always recommend that. And the other thing too I recommend, and we've heard this theme really echoed, is every company is going to want to handle this differently depending on your strategy, but you as communicators, while you're the frontline risk managers, you're not alone. And you have the opportunity to convene the rest of your organization, whether it's legal, security, government affairs, particularly with some of this ESG in the state and local level. Have those conversations and think about what you would do if and when common scenarios happen to you, because preparedness really does go a long way.
Fantastic. Anyone want to jump in? Megan, Anni, Karen?
Yeah, I mean, that's 100% through the extremism lens as well. Definitely find that to be true, is that if you just let people know, like, you're being dunked on, like, this is embarrassing for you, like, don't be fooled, then people tend to readjust a little bit. But I also think so many conspiracy theories, and the reason that people uptake even like benign ones all the way to obviously like there's a global cabal, you know, running the country and you need to take over the Capitol to stop it. Like the full spectrum, what we have found both through A/B testing, through like ads, like studying through every framework possible, is that this is all emotions-based. It's fear, it's anger, it's uncertainty. And when people are provided with conspiracy theories or extremist groups or just like one narrative that they can coalesce under, that gives them the sense of community that they're lacking. It gives them, you know, that validation, like all the evidence that you're compiling, other people are doing the same thing, sends them on a fact-finding mission. Everyone loves to do their own research, right? We all do it. Like who among us hasn't ended up at 4 a.m. like eating snacks and reading a whole Wikipedia page? It's very normal, right? And so I think, but that's ultimately, is people love a little quest, and I mean, that's why we like the Da Vinci Code, National Treasure, et cetera. People love to find answers, and Scooby-Doo. And like, I think, so ultimately, if you can tap into that, the desire to feel special, the desire to seek answers that no one else has, the desire to belong to something bigger than yourself, and to find a source of blame for your ails and like your frustrations, I think tapping into that and coming from that place of kind of empathy and understanding and humanizing the people who you disagree with, I think is a good place to start.
Great. Anni?
Yeah, that's consistent with data that we have too. I think oftentimes what we again saw in the pandemic, or sometimes when companies get targeted, is that people don't understand it. It's a complex problem. The pandemic was very complex and confusing, and people were looking for answers. But the government didn't know what's going on either, so naturally they turned to conspiracy theories because they had the answers and they were very simple and it was very clear what we had to do. So I think going ahead, getting ahead of these things where it's like, don't give people space to fill in the gaps. Like make sure you're very clear in your communication, address the underlying anxieties and uncertainties. And what also helps is probe people that something is coming, similar to what Lisa said, probe people that something is coming. Pre-bunking, yeah. Exactly. Inoculation theory, I don't know whether people are familiar with that, but it's kind of like, there's very strong evidence for how media training is successful in inoculating people against conspiracy theories and misinformation, kind of like explaining them, okay, how do you identify a conspiracy theory or misinformation or propaganda? There are like certain features in the message that are very clear. So if people are sensitized to that, they're less likely to adopt it in the first place. And it appears to work very well. It's very effective.
And we do, IPR, we do have research in our Behavioral Insights Research Center about inoculation theory, pre-bunking, and some other behavioral science models that can influence attitudes. All right, so maybe 30 seconds, Kieran, anything to add? And then we'll open it up to virtual. There's a virtual question. And then we'll do the mics before they give us the buzzer.
Sure. I mean, I'll add a bit about, I think, it just also summarizes some of the thoughts about political polarization. I think there was a discussion earlier also about like polarization in a workplace. How do we deal with that? And, academic literature on this, like just boiled it down to three aspects. So changing thoughts, encouraging relationships and looking at institutions. So thoughts as in, one of the biggest issues with like political polarization currently, I mean, political polarization in itself is not bad, but affective polarization, which is hating the other side, is a new thing, it's a bad thing, right? So, and a lot of surveys show that, if you ask a Democrat, they will feel like the extreme side of Republican is the average Republican. It's the same on the other side, right? Like, so communicating that these thoughts may not always be the case. Like, I think that's one way. Like encouraging relationships, like just talking to people on the other side, like will easily clarify a lot of these things. And the third thing is about institutions. A lot of these issues we're talking about, like extremism or QAnon, conspiracies, these things have a top-down nature, and a top-down solution is also a good solution to these. Like in a sense, like in an institution, like if you have these sorts of rules set up where you say, okay, this is what our company stands for, and this is what we are going to do. Like some of those kinds of things definitely do work out.
Fantastic. I think we have a virtual question. Tom Martin, are you the virtual question? That's your face. I have big on my screen, so.
Hi, Tina. Thanks, and thanks to everybody. It's a great panel. I'm Tom Martin. I teach at the College of Charleston. Just one thing I would just recommend if anybody's looking for a deeper dive on some of this, Elizabeth Williamson of the New York Times wrote a really good book on the Sandy Hook tragedy, and she specifically focuses on the conspiracy theorists, Alex Jones, who led that, but the people who participated in that. It's very much in keeping with what has been described about the national narcissism. This is more people deriving their personal identity from being involved in those kind of conspiracy theories. But my question really is getting back to this issue of what is the responsibility for companies to push their employees toward factual, accurate sources of information. I'm thinking specifically of things like the News Literacy Project, which is really trying to get at a more fact-based, accurate news, unbiased news. Should companies be actively doing that, especially leading up to the 2024 elections? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
That's a great question, Tom. Before I get to that, if anyone has a question, please come up to the mics. I'm sure we can ask one or two. Anyone want to take that? Lisa?
I definitely recommend that companies provide those types of trainings to their employees. When you think about it, like we all learned in high school how to read a news article, like this is what the lead is, how to read for bias, look at the date, look at the byline. But a lot of people haven't had that training for how media now appears on social media. And I think that that's definitely one thing that is important. I think the other thing is it is a true business risk if your employees believe disinformation. Think about an analyst making a trade because they believe something that was inaccurate. Think about the health risks. So I think employee education is a great way to be able to deal with this. The other thing too is a lot of the websites that are being used by sophisticated actors to spread disinformation are not leaving behind the greatest things on your company IT systems. And so also really having a robust program to be able to block access from those domains from a cybersecurity perspective can be another approach that companies can take.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, question.
Great. Hi, everyone. Ed Harnaga with Pfizer. Fascinating panel, something that we are dealing with every single day, and a big challenge that we see. And I was really pleased to hear about the focus on early detection, pre-bunking, inoculation. These are things that we're really sort of doubling down on. My question is, when we look at conspiracy theories that are much deeper rooted and that have really taken hold, the question that comes up every time that we battle with is, how much do you address it? Do you just give it more air, give it more oxygen? And if you are going to address it, how do you address it to shut it down? Because it is so deep-rooted in those circles. But what we're trying to prevent is that bleed over into other audiences that could be impacted by it. So I'd be interested in thoughts.
I have a couple of thoughts on it.
Oh, yeah.
It's a tough question, but I share a couple of thoughts. So, it's a very common concern, and I think early data was showing that, this idea of the more you hear a conspiracy theory, the more people latch onto it. And actually, there's more recent data that shows that that might not be the case. So the jury is out there. So what I think most people found to be most helpful to kind of avoid that situation is to state the conspiracy theory, but not in a very elaborate way, so a sentence or something, and then focus on debunking it. So actually just debunking information without kind of recapturing what you actually address appears to be less effective. So I can take one worry that is actually that the idea that the more people hear the conspiracy theory, the more likely they are adopting it is actually probably not that frequently the case. The same with the backfire effect. I'm sure you're aware of the idea that if someone is correcting false information, that then people are more engaged in it and believe it even more. More recent data shows that's also probably not the case, or it's very rare. Now I lost my train of thought. But yeah, so I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. Does someone else want to jump in?
You can jump in. So I think it really does depend on the situation, and I know that's not a satisfying answer at all. However, there are, I think, so I think pre-bunking can work. I think exposing and adding more information is really important too, particularly because disinformation narratives that are successful are often relying upon a kernel of truth. So if you're able to add more information and change the context of the narrative, whether it's by putting out additional information or by putting out like, for example, let's say, because it's Pfizer that we're talking about, let's say the Russians are saying your vaccine is not effective. Giving that as a scoop to a reporter to say, hey, this is what the Russians are doing. That way you're at least making sure that people who are reading that and believing it can then stay with you can be helpful. The other couple of things that I would consider too is also like, where is the narrative occurring? Is it like 1 or 2 posts on Twitter, no followers, like who cares, keep moving? Or is it 1 or 2 posts saying like, we're gonna show up to Pfizer headquarters and organize a protest in a space where highly motivated individuals may be organizing? So I do think a lot of that context matters. And like, for example, I think that's what Disney missed when a lot of the QAnon stuff started happening, is you can't always just look at volume. But I typically find that pre-bunking, if you catch it early enough, or adjusting your outward messaging strategy, less with the idea of like, you know, trying to refute a narrative, but more with the idea of trying to keep those audiences with you, can be pretty effective in building resilience.
Fantastic. Do you want to?
Oh, I would just like to add, there is a great resource from Data and Society about this exact topic. It's called The Oxygen of Amplification. It was written a few years ago, but it's like a great guidebook that kind of I go to when I'm writing publicly about extremist trends. So I think it would actually be a great resource for anyone in this room who wants to avoid that same trap.
Fantastic. So I really wanted to thank Lisa, Kieran, Megan, and Anni for being here today and talking about the dark side of influence. Thank you all. Woo.